Yes.
Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my family's story. My name is Rodi Glass, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. I'm a Holocaust survivor from Amsterdam, Netherlands, which is not usually known by the museum or people in around the United States, because people always assume that most of the people that were killed during the war came from the eastern part of Europe, but a lot of people were murdered and in concentration camps from the western part of Europe. And Holland had quite a high number out of 140,000 Jews that were living in Amsterdam or in Holland, really. 75% were killed, which is a very high number. It's the highest number in the western part of Europe. So, being that said, I have to tell you that I was born in 1936 in a wonderful, wonderful family on both sides of my mother's and my father's family. My mother was one of 6 siblings. My father was the youngest. He and his twin brother were the youngest of 7 siblings. To start my story, I have to give you a background of how my family was constructed. When my grandparents on my mother's side were very young, they moved to England. And this happened because Holland was in a recession, and my grandfather was a shoemaker by trade. In the olden days, everybody had to have a trade because they had to support their families when they weren't married and their families after they were married. My grandmother was a seamstress. My grandfather had high aspirations, and he wanted to be a businessman. Not that being a shoemaker was so bad, but he wanted to be a businessman, own a business. So he borrowed money, and this was in the early 1900s, like around 1903. And he decided that he was going to open up a business, but he was told not to because Holland was in a recession, and somebody suggested that he move to England. By then, they had a little baby who was 3 months old, and they did move to London. They had a hard time of it, but eventually he did have a business and 5 more children. And the second one born, and it's the first one, the second child, but the first child born in England was my mother, Sophie Kaiser. Their maiden name was Kaiser. So they lived in England till my mother was 16 years old, and they were getting lonesome for the family, and Holland was okay. So they moved back to Amsterdam and continued their lives there. And my grandfather opened up businesses there. My father's side was, my grandfather was a diamond cutter. He owned a little bar. They were not very well fixed for money, but my father always said, I never knew I was poor because my mother and father gave me a lot of love, and there was always food to eat. My oldest aunt met a gentleman, and they fell in love, and they got married. But the gentleman had a twin brother, and that was my dad. And my mom and dad got married in 1935. So there were 2 brothers and 2 sisters married. And my father's name was Waterman, his last name. And the Watermans and Kaisers became very close family, and we're always celebrating together. And then in 1936, I was born. My grandfather by then had 2 stores and a wholesale, and it was called Kaisers Lederhandel. I know on the PowerPoint there are some pictures. I don't know if Sierra can show it to you, but anyway, and the stores did quite well. Uh, Holland was, of course, I was little. I didn't know this, but Holland was hearing rumors about things not going well in Germany. And this was in 1933. Hitler came to power in Germany. And 1938 was Kristallnacht. And quite a number of German Jews decided to flee to Holland because Holland was not involved in World War I. It was neutral, and they thought that Holland would be a safe haven. Of course, it turned out not to be, but they didn't know that. Holland is a very small country, had no high rises, a lot of land, a lot of farmland. Amsterdam was the most populous city in the country and where most of the Jewish people resided. So these people were fleeing to Holland, and Holland didn't know what to do with them because there was no living facilities for them. There were no places. And a lot of them, most of them did not have money because they had to leave everything in Germany. Otherwise, Hitler wasn't going to let them out. So the Dutch government found a space in the eastern part of Holland called Westerbork, and they said they were going to build a compound for these people, like cabins and stuff like that, so these people could live there. Of course, since these people were Jewish, the Dutch government made Jewish people help with the money and pay for this. And so there was a big German Jewish population in Westerbork, and they were kind of living. They had food, and they had their own government, their own little government there, and they had a little hospital, and they did what they could, and they were living okay, fairly okay, I should say. And some of them, like Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father had a lot of money, so he didn't have to do that because he already had an apartment in Amsterdam, and he had the building where they were hidden was his because he was a wealthy man, and he had made arrangements before the dire time came. So, my grandfather met some of the German Jews that came into his store, and he helped them out with leather so they could sell some items. He would give them stuff so they could make a little money. And, we knew these people were there and that we had been good to them. So now time marches on, and I was going, I was 4 years old in 1940 when the Germans invaded Holland. Holland had a royal house, which they still have, a royal family, but the royal family knew what was happening, and they fled to England and eventually to Canada. And then the Parliament fled. Of course, if the royal family wouldn't have fled, the Germans would have killed them. But anyway, they left Holland stranded and in charge of the Dutch police. Of course, we didn't know this exactly what was going on, but this is what was happening. So in May 1940, May 10th, the Germans invaded Holland. They burned Rotterdam, which was the biggest harbor town, to the ground. A lot of people got killed. There was nothing left of the city. And then they marched into all the other cities, including Amsterdam. I still remember them marching in. We weren't allowed to go out or stand out. We had to put shades down, but we peeked out, and I can still, in my mind, I can still hear the marching of the boots, goose-stepping down the street. And pretty soon, our whole lives changed. The wonderful life that we had with family and parties and getting together and living a very free life stopped. Before 1940, we didn't realize that, Holland was not very anti-Semitic or not obvious. People never called you a dirty Jew, or they didn't burn synagogues or anything. But once the Germans invaded, anti-Semitism came to the surface. So a Dutch Nazi party started to come up called the NSB, and the Germans took over. The Germans then decided that they were going to make rules. And I just wanted to say that, Hitler was fighting two wars. There was the war for territory because he wanted Lebensraum, life room for his people, for the Aryans, and the other war was against Jews and gypsies and people he thought were unacceptable to him. That they were either not mentally correct, but mainly the Jews and anybody he thought was not worth living. So the German government in Amsterdam started a committee called the Joodse Raad, which is Judenrat in German, and it consisted of Jewish so-called prominent people like the head of the stock exchange, the head of the diamond exchange, the bank presidents, and they were in charge. And one of the first things they did, which was horrible in retrospect, was they told all the Jews, and again, as I said before, most of the Jews lived in Amsterdam, to come and register with their names, their telephone numbers if they had. Very few people had telephones, and their addresses. So now they have everybody's name and address, and you're like a fish in a barrel, but you didn't know it. And then the Germans started issuing rules for the Jews, mostly for the Jews. We had a curfew. We weren't allowed to go to school. We weren't allowed to have bicycles. They had to be handed in. We weren't allowed to have radios. You had to hand in. This didn't all happen in one day, but this is all how it happened in this year, 1941. You had to give in all your money, all your valuables. In other words, you weren't allowed in the parks. You weren't allowed in cafes. You weren't allowed to do anything. You were in your house, but you were mainly, it was a prison because you weren't allowed to go anywhere but walk down the street, and that was only at certain times. And my family was trying to do the best they could, but you live in fear and you don't know what's going on. And most, as I said before, most people did not have telephones. Naturally, there was no cell phones or computers or anything like that. The only way to communicate was by seeing each other on the street. And if you invited somebody for a party, or you said, come over for lunch, or we're having a birthday party, you would see each other on the street because Amsterdam was not big. And on Sunday, everybody took a walk and you would meet up with each other. And it was wonderful. And as time went on in 1941, starting 1942, you would walk down the street and see less of your family. And then we got to know that the Germans were moving people, picking up the Jewish people and moving them to concentration camp. The Germans saw this place, Westerbork, where the German refugees had gone to, and decided that was a wonderful place for a concentration camp. And they started building big barracks in addition to the little cottages that the German, they're called Kampensassen, had. And they built barracks and made it into a concentration camp. In September 29th, 1942, my parents, by the way, the whole family, everybody worked in my grandfather's businesses. And my parents had gone home, which was across the street from the main store above the warehouse, and put me to sleep. And I was 6 years old at the time. And my parents were trying to rest a little bit. And there's a big banging on the door. Open your door, open your door. And they opened the door, and the German said, "Draus, draus, you got to come out." And this is late at night. And my mother said, "I can't do that now. My baby is sleeping. Come back tomorrow." Well, they thought she was definitely had lost her mind. They said, and they kept screaming. So my mother dressed me. My parents were still dressed. She took her handbag. My father went the way he was, and they put us in an army truck and took us along with other people who were on the truck to the central station in Amsterdam. They put us on the trains, and we didn't know where we were going. And we went to a town called Hooghalen, which is about 6.5 kilometers from Westerbork, because the railway tracks did not go any further. They didn't go into Westerbork. In the middle of the night, in the rain, it is all very sandy and muddy there. We walked to Westerbork with the other people. And my mother was holding my hand, and it was a mess, to say the least. So when we got to the camp, they separated my mom and dad, and I was with my mom. And they didn't do anything to us. We just had to stay there and not know what was going on and live in fear. And after about 5 days, we were called up, the names, and we had to be outside on the Appelplatz, which was the place where we got counted every day to make sure nobody escaped. And there were Germans, officers, sitting behind long tables with lists. And my mother looks up and sees one of the officers was a young man, and she knew him because he lived on the same street where our store was. And his mother was German, his father was Dutch. They had a little lending library, but he hung out with my mother's younger brother. They were the same age, and they were friends, because before the war, there was no reason not to be friends. So he had on a German Nazi, uniform. He had joined the SS. And he looked at my mother, he recognized my mother, and he gave her a look to say, "Don't show that you know me." And she didn't. And he had the list with the names, and the people were all sent through. And when he came to our name, he scratched our name off the list. Now, that was a lucky moment, because if he had not done that, I would not be sitting here talking to you, because that was one of the first transports from Westerbork to Auschwitz. And we would have been, or Sobibor, where they sent the Dutch Jews. A lot of the Dutch Jews were killed in Sobibor. And we would have been dead. It would have been murdered. There was a railway in the camp. As I said before, the train from Amsterdam didn't go as far as Westerbork, but they had built trade tracks with the cattle cars in Westerbork to go to the east, to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, or wherever the camp they decided to send you. So we went back to our barrack, and in the meantime, there was another situation where my uncle, the one I was saying was a friend to this, prior to this guy was a Nazi, but before that, my youngest uncle was walking down the street in Amsterdam, and a woman who worked for an attorney approached him and said, "Phil," his name was Phil, she says, "there is a guy, non-Jewish guy, who is in cahoots with the Nazis, and they're selling spares." A spare is like a paper that gives you, a spare is like a barrier, actually, is the main words, but it was called a spare. And he's selling spares. And what you do is you have to pay him 120,000 guilders per person. and he gives it to the Germans, and the Germans give you a paper saying that you're not going to be sent to the East. So my uncle was still young. He was not even 20. And he said, well, I don't know. He says, we're not supposed to have any money because, we had to get, as I said before, had to give in our valuables and money to the Germans. He says, I have to go talk to my father. Well, my grandfather had been very smart. He didn't give all his money to the Germans. He gave some to the non-Jewish tanners that we worked with in the southern part of Holland, who we did business with, and asked them to hide his money, which they did. So when my uncle came back to his father and said to him, Dad, we can do so and so, my grandfather said, you know what, maybe we should take a chance. But there were 11 people times 120,000 guilders. So you do the math, it's a lot of money. But he had it. And now he had to contact the people in the South, which wasn't easy, and get the money back, which wasn't easy either, but they got it back. And they gave this money to this guy. Now he was really taking a chance because the guy could have taken the money and said, well, thank you very much and goodbye, or turned us into the Nazis, to the German government, and we would have been killed immediately because we weren't allowed to have this money. But he didn't, and we got the Speer. And I don't, if you can show the picture of the Speer, it's a black picture, and I don't know if you can read it, but it says on the bottom that in German, that for the time being, you are free of being evacuated. Now, remember, for the time being could be 5 minutes from now, it could be a week from now, it could be a month from now, but you don't know. So it was a form, but it was iffy. But anyway, while my parents and I were in Westerbork in 1942, you see that it's dated September 42. My grandfather had just gotten the Speer, and we were sent back to Amsterdam. Then the Germans decided they were going to take over the Jewish businesses, and they put a German officer in our store, and he knew nothing about anything, and he certainly didn't know how to run a business. So they kept my mother in the store, and instead of taking all the money into the register, she took some and put it in her pocket because we needed money to live, because there was no food to be gotten, and we had ration coupons, but the farmers would come in with butter and eggs and milk, and my mother could pay them out of her pocket and give them. That was called the black market. It was, and that's how we got to eat. So when the German decided that he had enough of us, he had us arrested again, and this time with my grandparents, and we were sent to Westerbork again. And again, the Speer got us back to Amsterdam. In the meantime, my father's family and my mother's extended family, my grandparents' family, they're all disappearing. And we knew they were being sent to Westerbork and then to the east, but we didn't know. Nobody knew that they were being sent to their death. We thought they were hard labor camps. So in the meantime, in September, and the people that were looking for the Jews, that were finding the Jews in Amsterdam and in Holland, were the Dutch police. I have to tell you, they were not wonderful. I know there's a rumor going around that the Dutch, yes, there were wonderful Dutch people who hid Jews, but they were in the minority, because most of the Jews would not have been arrested if it wasn't for the Dutch police. Anyway, now it's getting later in 1943. It gets to be the middle of 43, and there are not many Jews left. And there's not many Jews left in the whole of Holland. So the Germans made an ordinance that all the Jews in the country were being moved to Amsterdam. And we had to move out of our homes, and they put us in a neighborhood that had empty apartments, and it was a ghetto. It was not a ghetto with barbed wire, but it was a ghetto. We had to be there and nowhere else. And then in September of 1943 was the last raid of Amsterdam in Holland. And we were all sent, and my mother's family, most of, my father's family, as I said before, were already gone, and they were already dead. And we were all sent to Westerbork again. Now, at the beginning of my talk, I told you that my mother and her siblings were born in London. And the reason I told you that is because that's another part of my survival. Number 3 child of the sister that was born after my mother still had her British passport, because they were born in England, and she had a passport, and the passport was valid until 1945, but there was nothing she could do. She definitely could not go to England, but she had gone to the Swiss consulate in Amsterdam in the beginning of the war, and the woman said, "Don't ever let go of your passport. Keep it with you wherever you go." And my aunt did that. That was my Aunt Janie. And when we got to Westerbork, the rumors were flying, and who's going where and what's happening, and people are being transported. And there was a woman that came to the camp, Frau Schlottke, a Nazi woman, who came and listened to some of the people, if you had, let's call issues or complaints or something to talk about. And my aunt got an appointment with her and went with her passport, and the woman said, "Oh," in German, and my aunt didn't speak German and the woman didn't speak Dutch, but there was a German Jewish woman who was doing the translating, and she knew my aunt because her husband had benefited by my grandfather's philanthropy when he gave these people merchandise so they could make a few guilders. Anyway, so she told my aunt, in a way, "Don't talk, I'll do the translating." And the German woman, Frau Schlottke, says, "Oh, you're British. Okay, then you're going to go to a different camp called Vittel." And my aunt didn't know what she was talking about. And she said, "What about my husband?" She says, "Well, your husband is Dutch," which he was. But the lady, the translating lady said, "No, he's not Dutch. He was stateless. And the papers of his birth were burned in the consulate in Rotterdam when Rotterdam was bombed at the beginning of the war, and it was all burnt, and he's stateless." And for some reason, Frau Schlottke took her word for it, and they were both going to Vittel. So my aunt comes back and goes to different barracks. We were in different barracks. I was with my mom in a barrack, and my youngest aunt, who is still alive and is going to be 101 in August. And she's the only one remaining of the 6 children of my grandfather right now. And she told my mother and my aunt what was going on. So my mother and my aunt got an appointment, and we got also permission to go to Vittel. And there's a paper on the, I think it's on the thing too, that says that we were allowed to go to Vittel. And that's it, yes. And that was for my dad. And my dad was Dutch from way back. So were my grandparents. And somehow or other, my grandparents got permission to go to Vittel. And that was on the 7th of March, 1944. We went on the 3rd of September, 1944, we were allowed to go to Vittel. We didn't know what Vittel was. my mother's oldest sister, the young baby that was not born in Holland, and it was and not born in England rather, and was married to my father's twin brother, decided she wasn't going to go to this woman and tell her about and lie about the fact that she was born in England. She says, "Oh, she says, you know what, Maurits and I will just go to. Well, we're going to Bergen-Belsen. How bad could it be?" Well, in retrospect, we know it was very bad. He did not survive. He was killed there, and she survived and was never the same person. Anyway, and that's how we got to Vittel, which is a spa. You might have heard of the Vittel water, and it was a spa in France. The reason they took the spa is not to give us spa treatments. It was because it had hotels, and the Germans took it over, and they had rooms for all the people. Now, Vittel was not a Jewish camp. It was a mixed camp of people who were born in the United States citizens and English citizens. And it was, in essence, a hostage camp. And we stayed there till the end of the war. And we were fed by the Red Cross, and we were not beaten, and we were not mishandled, but we were imprisoned. Now, going back to the camp in Westerbork, we were assigned barracks, and we were in 3-story bunk beds, which were made out of metal, and they were with straw mattresses. And we had been told on the last transport, they sent out, got very organized, the Germans, as they were, and they told us what to bring, and that we had to bring a plate and a spoon and a cup and stuff like that. And the women in Westerbork had to work in the kitchen and make soup. They called it soup. It was water with a potato in it, but they had to peel potatoes. And the men had to work in the tailor barrack, whatever your trade was. My father worked in the tailor barrack because he had been raised as before he married my mother, he was a tailor. And my grandfather was in the shoemaker barrack. And they were trying, they were doing the shoes not for the prisoners. They were doing the shoes and the clothes for the Nazi soft officers and soldiers. And they were trying to sabotage them by burning some of the stuff and ripping some of the stuff. It was just a minor form of sabotage, but they tried. And because if you got caught, you know what the bottom line was. And myself, I was a child, and I played in the dirt. We had no school. And going back a little bit, I have to tell you that I learned to read by chance when I was about 4 years old. I knew how to read, and that's all I knew. I had no education, and I didn't have education until we came back to Holland in 1945. The camp in Westerbork, the barracks were only cold water. There were 350 people in the barrack with one toilet. If you had to go out to a special barrack where they took plywood, made holes in it, and you had to sit on the plywood and do your business. And then the prisoners, the men, had to go down there and clean up all this mess. And one of my uncles had to do that. And it was, they were demeaning us in every which way. And I knew better than to go near the barbed wire, because my mother told me, don't ever go near the barbed wire, because you see these people in the tower, they will kill you. And as little as I was, I understood, and I was obedient. And we had no extra clothes. We had nothing. And also what happened in the barracks is that sometimes, the little bit of food that you got, people would steal from each other, because they really made the people it brought out the worst in people. And in those situations, and you were forever living in fear. As a matter of fact, before we were arrested and we were still in Amsterdam, every night, every day, you were in fear. You had your Jewish star on. If you didn't have a Jewish star, you'd be arrested because you had to show your ID card. I wore a star when I was 6 years old. You had to put on the Jewish star, which ironically was on ration coupons. The Germans told us to get a Jewish, that we had to wear the Jewish star, but we had to pay a ration coupon and pay for it and then sew it on. I mean, they didn't just hand them out. So that was, their way of doing business. And people lived in fear all the time. And sometimes I think people were even relieved to go to the camps because then you were there already. I mean, you lived in fear there too, but it was a different type of fear. And you never knew when your day would come. So back to Vittel, we were on a train without food and without water, not a cattle car, it was a regular passenger train. And we got to Vittel, France. We had no idea where this was. I mean, my parents had not traveled to France and my family. But anyway, we had, we survived it there. And one day, my aunt tells me there was a little old man walking outside the camp because the camp was part of the city, but it was cordoned off with barbed wire. We were behind barbed wire, of course. And it was a little old man walking down the street because the other side was the town where the villagers lived, the people lived. And they couldn't figure out why this little old man was walking around there and looking. And a couple of days later, the French underground called the Maquis came to try to liberate us. And then they realized that this little old man was not a little old man. He was a young man in disguise. And he was just, looking up to see how there was the best way to get into the camp. And the first thing they did was shoot the commander of the camp. And they took over the camp, but it didn't hold. And the Germans came back and defeated the Maquis, the French underground. And then we were behind electrified barbed wire, make sure that we couldn't get out. And then in September, again, everything happened to us in September. The American army came in 1944 and liberated us. It was a wonderful day. They were so wonderful and beautiful and sweet and kind. And we didn't, we were just, everybody was overjoyed. And I remember a soldier saying to my mother, "Hi, that's a cute little girl you have there." If you can imagine, I was, I guess. And he said, and he gave my mother fruit and candy for me. I hadn't had seen candy or fruit. I didn't even know what it was. And the picture she's showing you now is VE Day. That's Victory in Europe Day. That was later. But anyway, so the Americans took over our camp and they didn't know exactly what to do with us. And they found out that we were from Holland. But we could not go back to Holland because Holland was still occupied. Holland was not liberated till May of 1945. So they moved us to another town called La Bourboule because the American army took over Vittel for their army to be headquartered. And we went to another place way south of Paris called La Bourboule, which also was a spa town. And they put us up in the hotel buildings there. And the Red Cross gave us food. And it was also a little French town. And our whole family was there. And my mother decided to find out about the school, and I was allowed to go to the French school. And I didn't speak a word of French. I could barely write. But I went to French school and I learned French. And the principal of the school took a liking to my mother. And she invited my mother and I over to her house for tea and cake. Well, my mother hadn't had tea in years, and I had never had tea or cake. And it was just wonderful. And she gave me a book, and she was a wonderful, wonderful lady. And then, as time went on, when Holland was liberated, my mother became the head of the family, more or less, and she got permission from the army to go to Paris to the Dutch consulate and get permission to come, papers authorizing us that we could go back to Holland. So she came back to Liverpool, and we packed up whatever little bit we had. Believe me, we had nothing. I had holes in my shoes. My mother cut out the front of the shoes because I had no new shoes, and my toes stuck out of the shoes. Then I wore Dutch, in Holland, I wore Dutch clogs, we had nothing. And we took the train. We were 3 days on the train without food and water, and we went back to Holland. We were liberated, but we weren't free. We didn't know what we were liberated to. We didn't know what was going on. I mean, it's just, you're being sent places. And we got off the train in the central station, the same central station where we were left when we were arrested first time. And the Dutch government agents were waiting for us, and they gave us each 10 guilders. My grandfather paid 120,000 guilders for each person. So 10 guilders is a stipend. It's nothing. And they gave us a lariat that we had to wear that had a big sign on it with a D. And D meant dakloos. And dakloos in English means homeless, which was very, very demeaning. And I mean, it kind of, everybody started to cry. I mean, homeless? We were homeless. So they put us up in what used to be orphanages and places where the orphans had been, Jewish orphans had been killed by the Germans. We were put up in different places. And then the Dutch government started schools for the younger children like myself. I was 9 years old. But all age children were in the same place because we all knew nothing. We all had no education. We all knew nothing. So we had to catch up, and we all had to catch up and with our learning all at the same time. And after about a year and a half, we were then sent to regular schools. My parents, my family, the business was still there. And the Dutch Nazi was in the store. And my grandparents lived upstairs of the store before the war. And he was living there with his wife. And my father walked into the store and grabbed a man physically and threw him out of the store. And I cannot tell you what he said because it's not for publication, but he threw him out and his wife, and my grandparents went back into their house. And their mom, dad, and I were eventually assigned a house, an apartment that was owned by a Dutch Nazi, and it was still filled with his furniture and everything. And he was in jail because by now the Dutch government was putting the Dutch Nazis in jail, shaving their heads and, incarcerating them. And we lived there. And in the attic, we found boxes full of Nazi paraphernalia and books and stuff like that. By then, my father had found out through Red Cross lists that his whole family, all his sisters and brothers, and their children and the babies and everybody had been killed. So he was not in a normal state of mind. And he took all this stuff and he couldn't look at it and he burnt it off. In retrospect, it would have been a good thing to save, but I can't blame him for what he did. And we lived in that apartment. And I went to school and I was, trying to lead a life. And they were rebuilding the store and merchandise became available and we were going back to a normal life. And my mother's two sisters decided to move to the United States. And they moved to Chicago. And because my one aunt, her husband, his parents and family had gone to Chicago, so you go where people are that you know. And in 1950, my aunt said to my mother, they didn't talk by phone because that was too expensive, but they wrote letters. And she said, you have to come to the United States because there's going to be another war. And my mother had been in England during World War I. They were in the bunkers and everything. It was not a Jewish war. It was just a war. And she says, now you went through a second war. She says, you want to go through a third war. You have a child. It's irresponsible. So they decided then to ask for a visa to come to the United States. So in April 1951, April 25th, my grandparents and my parents and I arrived in the United States in Hoboken. And my Aunt Janie met us there and we stayed in New York for a few days. It was Passover and we were invited by friends for Pesach. And to me, it was like a big blur because I had never seen a TV. I had never seen anything, and it was noisy and loud and dirty in the day. And I didn't like it, and I wanted to go back to Holland. And my mother said, nothing doing. And then we got on the train and came to Chicago. And my uncle, we were picked up by my uncles and my other aunt. And we stayed with them for a while. And then we all got our own apartment. My grandparents, my parents, and I lived in one apartment. And the third day here, my mother had a job. My father went to night school and he got a job. And I went to school. And again, it was an adjustment because I was not accepted because the children here in the United States, the young people, I went to high school, it was called Hyde Park High School. People weren't used to foreigners. And nowadays it's so different because, everybody's from, a lot of people are from somewhere else or have parents who are from somewhere else. But they looked at me like I was really weird. And maybe I was. And it was hard because I had to learn English and I had to adjust. And again, and I didn't have many friends, but one girl befriended me. And at one point she said to me, you have to go to the prom. And I didn't know what a prom was. I didn't know what she was talking about. And then I said, what are you talking about? And she explained it to me. I said, no, that's not for me. And she said, yes, you have to go. So she had a cousin and she asked him to take me to the prom. And he said, who is this one? Who is this girl? And she told him I came from Europe. And he said, I'm not taking a foreigner to the prom. So somebody else fixed me up with a boy, and my aunts were nice enough to buy me a beautiful dress. And I went to the prom and had a miserable time. But anyway, I went to the prom. So afterwards, we went back to school. And then after we got our report cards and we went to the Indiana Dunes. By then I knew a few more people and they took me along. And this young man, he kept looking at me and then he kept talking to me. And we started to date. And that was the young man who said he would not take a foreigner to the prom. But he didn't know that I was that girl. And that was 1953. Excuse me a minute. In 1955, we got married. We were married for 62 years. And we had a wonderful life together. We had 3 beautiful children, 6 wonderful grandchildren. We have 4 great grandchildren. He only lived to see one. And life turned out beautiful for me. So in retrospect, I have to say that luck played a big part in my life. I've been a very lucky person. Luck for surviving, luck for meeting the right people, luck for having a beautiful family and wonderful friends. And it's just luck. It's not, it's, you know, I always tell my friends what my motto is. It's better to be lucky than to be smart. And I have to say that Hitler took my youth, and he took my youth, but he didn't take my whole life. And all these people that my husband and I had, all my family, all the 13 people, are my revenge for what Hitler was trying to do to us. And we were rebuilding the Jewish population. I have to just go back a minute and tell you again about, I don't want to beat down on the Dutch people, but there was a point where the Dutch police were hunting for Jews, and they were getting money, ransom, for every Jew that they traded in. And I read a book, it's called Ransom, and it's just horrible what people will do for a few guilders and for hatred and for no reason at all. Because the Jewish people have not done anything bad in this world. We have always been kind on the most part. We have been philanthropic. We have developed in Israel now, they're developing such wonderful things and for the world, for the good of the world. We have never started a war. So why do they hate us so? Why are we hated? I have no idea. And I cannot figure it out. And I hope that these atrocities will stop and that people will stop hating each other. And just because of religion or color or whatever, can't we all live in a beautiful world that this is together peacefully? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rodi. Did you want to take a couple of questions?
Of course.
Okay, we'll give everybody a second. One I do have is, what kind of, when you do field trips, what kind of messages do you share to students, and what do you want them to kind of take away from your story?
When I speak to the students, I tell them to be out. Our logo, you know, our motto at the museum is to be an upstander and not to be a bystander. When you see something bad happen, try to do something about it. And I also tell them not to believe all the orators, the people who talk loud and scream and bang and on their podiums and scream. Don't believe them. Think for yourself. Get educated so you can think for yourself. That's what I try to tell them.
Perfect messaging. Another question we tend to get is, can you kind of talk about how and why you got involved with the museum and why you felt it was important to share your story?
Well, when we came to the United States, we never spoke about the Holocaust outside of our home. In Holland, of course, you know, Holland is a different situation because the whole country was occupied. It wasn't just against the Jews, it was also against the citizens of Holland, and they suffered also, you know, with the hunger winter and everything. But when we came to the United States, we just didn't talk about it, and the only way we spoke about it was amongst ourselves, and we were together as family. You know, family was very important because I was always with my family. I never had many outside friends at the time. And when we used to talk and exchange stories, and some of them were even funny, believe it or not, and we would always talk about it. So my husband, when he came into the family, that's how he knew about it. And my children heard about it probably to the point where they didn't want to hear about it, but they did. But we never talked about it. And a little aside, when we lived in Chicago and my grandfather went down to throw the garbage out, a woman was there at the same time, a neighbor, and she said, "Oh, you're new here." And my grandfather spoke English because he, I told you he had the business in England and he lived in England for many years. And he said, yes, yes. He says, "I'm originally from Amsterdam, Holland." And he said, and she says, "Oh," and they started to talk about somehow or other. She brought up the war. And my grandfather said, "Yes, yes, we are Holocaust survivors. We're survivors." And she said, "Yes, it wasn't so great here either. We couldn't even get nylon stockings." So my grandfather came upstairs and he forbade us to ever talk about the Holocaust outside of the house. He says, "People just don't understand it. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to know about it. So don't talk about it." Okay. But I went to Hyde Park High School and I met some people there, but we never talked. They were German Jews who had come here, fled here from Germany, but I didn't know that at the time. And I moved to Highland Park, where I live now, with my husband and my children. And I was grocery shopping and I met Ralph Reebok, who I went to high school with. And he was telling me about the museum and he said, "You should come and talk." And I said, "No, I don't talk about it." And then I met him another time and he kept telling me I should do that. So I finally said, "Okay, maybe I should." And I went to the museum on Main Street and I was interviewed by a rabbi there who barely spoke English himself. And he heard me talk and he said, "Okay, you're in." So I started speaking on Main Street, and that's how I got involved with the museum. And it's part of my life and it's in my heart.
We're so happy to be able to hear your story and give you the opportunity to share it with all the students that come in. That's all the questions we have right now. So I am going to let you say goodbye to everybody and thank them for coming in.
Okay. I thank you very much for tuning in. Join us here next Wednesday, August 5th at 10 o'clock to hear Holocaust survivor Adina Sala share her story. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times. And thank you again.